after spending a few days making a full-throated defense for the federal system that we have here in the United States, now that we're going to turn back to our discussion on idioms, I thought it would be apropos that we look at some idioms that come from the old country, the United Kingdom, England. There are far more idioms in English language in America that come from England than you might think. Now, you might think, hey, there are probably a lot of them, and you're right, but it's even more than you have any idea. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm going to talk about the ones that have popped up for me most often. If you have any other suggestions, I'm happy to hear them. Make sure that you send me an email, rob@robexplains.com, or you can send me a message via anchor.fm/robexplains. /message. And if you send a voicemail, I can actually play it in a future show. I'm happy to do that. But let's dive into the idioms that I've chosen for today. The first one is bigwig. Now, a bigwig, of course, we all know is the boss. It's somebody who's in charge. And this actually comes from a very literal place. In the 18th century, in the United Kingdom, the most important political people especially, but the most important people in general, would wear the biggest wigs. And that was a literal thing. They were wearing very big, very white, very powdered wigs. And thus, the big wig, the person who was in charge, was the one with the biggest wig. Another one that I might not have expected to be from the United Kingdom, but once I learned the backstory, kind of made sense, is the idea of raining cats and dogs. And I'll tell you, it never really made sense to me, the entire, hey, it's raining cats and dogs outside. Didn't really get it. And in fact, I think the funniest use of this in pop culture was when The Office tried to get Phyllis to use, I think it was 10 idioms about rain before the noontime, and they almost made it, but they didn't quite get there. But this idiom has two stories that could possibly be the source for raining cats and dogs. The first is that there is a Norse tradition that cats would symbolize heavy rain, and dogs would symbolize the god of storms, or they were associated with the god of storms, Odin. So when Norse mythology came over to the United Kingdom via the Saxons, the Saxon invasion, that they brought that Norse mythology with them, and that it just kind of invaded and was pervasive inside the language. And so when it's raining cats and dogs, it's the goddess of rain and the god of thunder outside together. Now, a second version, which does make a little more sense to me, is that in 16th century England, most houses had thatched roofs, or they used thatching as a type of roofing material. Now, in a world where floors were dirt and open fires in the kitchen were the only source of warmth, the roof was actually a place where pets, especially domesticated small animals, could get warmth. They would burrow down into the thatched roof, which would actually hold the heat from the kitchen, and it would be a really warm place to stay. But when it would rain really heavily, the thatching would get very slippery. And if you were to poke your head outside to take a look at the rain, you might just see a dog or a cat slipping off the roof eaves and coming down to the ground. And of course, that made it look like it was almost raining real cats and dogs. The next one is every cloud has a silver lining. And if you would have asked me, I would have guessed that this was actually an American idiom, because the idea that every negative occurrence has some sort of positive aspect to it, that feels like a very Americanism to me. But it actually originates from the United Kingdom. It's an expression that can be traced back to directly to a piece that was written in 1634 by English poet John Milton. John Milton is, of course, famous for writing Paradise Lost, When I Consider How My Light Is Spent, and many, many other epic poems. But he wrote a poem called Comus, a Masque Presented at Ludlow Castle, and in it he spoke of a silver lining of brightness behind a gloomy cloud, and then soon afterward, the idea of Milton's clouds, became a staple of English literature and the English hierarchy. So other people in their work made reference to the idea of Milton clouds, or clouds that had a silver lining behind the gloom. And later in the 1800s, a time when in the United Kingdom there was a level of optimism and positivity, especially in the upper class, in the age of Queen Victoria, the idea of clouds with a silver lining, those John Milton clouds, just pervaded the public, and they started using it as an idiom. Another idiom that I would have really guessed was American, read someone the riot act. Now, of course, reading someone the riot act means to give somebody a strong warning that they have to improve their behavior or there are going to be very stiff consequences. My dad loved to use this talking about me to other people, that he read me the riot act and I was going to straighten up. But this is of English origin, and it actually comes from an actual riot act. In 18th century England, the Riot Act was a legal document, and it was signed by the king and passed by Parliament, and essentially it was a script, much like you might hear on cops today. You know the script that comes from cops. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Well, the Riot Act was very similar. It was written out on a piece of paper, and if there was a crowd bigger than 12 people that needed to be dispersed, the first thing that happened is a constable or some of the troops had to read that Riot Act to them. If they were considered a threat to the peace or there was some concern about that group, the public official would trot out and read a small part of the act that had to be read aloud, and they were given 1 hour to disperse. Anyone that remained after that 1 hour period was subject to arrest or removal by force. So essentially it was a warning that if you do not leave, you may be taken under arrest or we may force you to move. But it required actually reading the Riot Act. One last one for today. Go out and paint the town red. Now, I made an assumption when I've heard that, and my research kind of proved it correct and in other ways didn't. But those of you who may not be more worldly may not know what a red light district is. But a red light district is the area of a city where debauchery can occur. Even in places where they have very strict rules, generally in a city, some areas are considered open for things that may not be allowed other places. That's the red light district. And I assume that paint the town red was in some semblance of saying, hey, go out and, treat most of the city like the red light district. Essentially, we use it now to mean that you can just go out and have a crazy good time or go act wild. And in that way, it's very similar to its source. And one of the sources of that idiom is, in fact, that when British people visited the American West, that they essentially said, cowboys are crazy and they are treating entire towns like red light districts. Just drinking in public and brothels everywhere, gambling seemingly everywhere. Every corner of that town is a red light district. However, the version that I am choosing to believe comes from an 1837 incident with the Marquis of Waterford. Now, he was infamous for his mischief and, like most of the upper crust of England, could seemingly get away with whatever he wanted to. And on one particularly crazy night, they got intoxicated and then they ran around town, knocking over flower pots, pulling knockers off of doors, and breaking windows. But one of the other things that they did was, for some reason, they decided to paint the front doors of a bunch of houses red. So when you were painting the town red, you were acting like the Marquis de Waterford and going around and being drunk and crazy. But no matter how you choose to paint the town red, let's leave the painting to the professionals, shall we? I hope you enjoyed the last episode on English idioms. We're going to wrap up our set of English idioms today with a part 2. There were just so many, I couldn't get to them in a single episode, so let's jump right in. The first one is something that you've probably said yourself or something that you've heard before, and that's don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Now, most people would probably say, that's pretty obvious. Why would you throw out the baby with the bathwater? But we use it today to mean don't discard something valuable along with other things or accidentally amongst other things that aren't valuable. This comes of an English origin from back in the 16th century. Essentially, before the Victorian age, before the Elizabethan age even, there was a practice of only bathing once a year. I can't imagine it. I'm sure that it had an interesting smell involved with it. But once a year, bath day came. And when that day came, everyone shared the same bath. Not at the same time, but they shared the same bath water. And usually, The man of the house went first, and he got the cleanest and warmest water. Then his oldest son, followed by his next son, all the men of the house bathed. After that, the women of the house, starting with the wife and then moving down through the daughters. And of course, the last one in the bathtub was the baby. Now, at the end of this routine, the water would sometimes be so dark because so many dirty people, after not having bathed for a year, had used the water that mothers would have to be careful to check the water and make sure there wasn't a baby in it before they tossed out the bathwater. And that disgusting historical lesson gave us an idiom to use today. This next one is equally as disturbing, but maybe not as disgusting. And that's having a skeleton in the closet. Now, of course, if someone has a skeleton in their closet, they have a big secret, something that they would be super embarrassed about, or something that could ruin a part of their lives, their work, their relationships, something like that. But it actually comes from 19th century England, when there were actual skeletons in actual closets. Before the United Kingdom passed the Anatomy Act in the middle part of the 19th century, the only way to get an anatomical example of the human body, whether it was a skeleton or organs or any bit to study, was to go see a grave robber. Grave robbers actually supplied skeletons and other parts for medical schools. When a raid of a medical school would occur, the teachers would try to hide the skeletons and other body parts in closets and other locked spaces so that they wouldn't have them confiscated because they were expensive and very hard to get. So at that point, they had actual skeletons in actual closets, which were still secrets that could get them in a lot of trouble. Our next one is something that is truly British, and unless you know British people or watch a lot of British TV, you may not know what it is. But I wanted to include it because I have actually used it in some of my online streaming during Warzone, and that is Bob's Your Uncle. And it seems so strange, but it seems like a lot of British people use the term, well, yeah, Bob's your uncle. It's essentially an exclamation that means you've achieved something simply, or that you've found a really easy way to accomplish something. Most often, when I think of it in giving directions. So you would say, go down to the corner, you make a left, you follow that down 3 blocks, make a right, and then at the end of that, when you hit a T, 1 more left, and Bob's your uncle, you'll be right there. So essentially, Bob's your uncle just means it's that easy. But where does it come from? It actually comes from the nepotism of Lord Salisbury. In 1886, Prime Minister Robert Gascoigne Cecil, who was Lord Salisbury, surprisingly made a relatively unknown person, Arthur Balfour, the Chief Secretary of Ireland. At that point, Ireland was a territory, a part of the United Kingdom. And Balfour, that is, was Prime Minister Robert, Lord Salisbury's favorite nephew. It seemed as though Arthur Balfour accomplished something incredible, something amazing, reaching one of the highest positions of government. And he did so with relative ease. But how did he do that? Well, Bob was his uncle. And I wanted to follow up that very British idiom with one that is maybe used a lot in America, but I think really relates back to the United Kingdom the most. And that is, the proof is in the pudding. My mom used to use the proof is in the pudding all the time when I was talking about my schoolwork or sports or anything. But I never really understood that. What does it mean, the proof is in the pudding? But when you find out the source of that, and how it relates back to England, it makes a lot more sense. Now, this idiom can be used in a lot of different ways, and some of these ways are seemingly much different than the others. In fact, they may contradict each other. So it could really just be connotation and denotation that lets you know which version the person is using. But one version of interpretation is that there is evidence to back up a previously made claim, and specific evidence is intrinsic to the object in question. For instance, a lot of people in my fantasy football league have been bragging about how well they were going to do this year. Well, the proof is in the pudding, meaning if you think you're going to do well, we're going to see based on your team and how they do. A second interpretation can be that the process of achieving something isn't important as long as the end product is good. For many people, going back to school or college is something that they're doing now, that we have a lot more time at home. Well, it may be a long and arduous process, but the payoff at the end is worth it. The proof is in the pudding. The third interpretation, and probably the one that is most often used, is that the success of something can only be measured by putting it to its intended use. Essentially, you have to kind of try a thing before you buy it to know that it's good at what it's going to be doing. It's hard to do this a lot, but cars are a great example. You think this car looks very fast and it looks very comfortable. The best thing you can do, and the only thing you can do, is try the car out to see if it meets those standards that you're looking for. Now, this idiom comes from a little bit longer British idiom. It's been shortened in an Americanization process, but the old British idiom was, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Now, that makes sense, and that does fit the third description, the third interpretation of this idiom. Now, the American version makes a lot less sense. The proof is in the pudding. Seems like you're skipping something there. But in the end, it all goes back to the use of the word proof in 16th century England. At that time, the word proof was essentially interchangeable with the word test. Pudding in the United Kingdom is also much different in many ways than the United States. We think of the gelatinous product made by Jell-O, but in England, pudding is something more like a minced meat dish. It's like a pie. So the original British meaning, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, was a way to say, listen, it doesn't have to look pretty, it doesn't have to smell great, but if it tastes good, that's really the test. The test of the pudding is in the eating, or the test of the pie is in the eating. And in that way, you can see how that third descriptor, that third interpretation makes the most sense, but Americans always have a way of making something their own. And you can also see, if using the word proof and interchanging that with test, that the other two may work just as well, depending, again, on the connotation or the denotation. Before we wrap on this series about the American system of governance, I thought it would be important to talk about how we elect those people. Now, we've talked about the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary branch, but of course the most controversial of all of those elections is the executive branch. And we are coming up on an executive branch election in just a few weeks. 10 days as of the recording of this, to be exact. And a lot of people are calling for the election of the executive to become a popular election because, you may or may not know, right now it's not. It's not about who gets the most votes. That is not how we elect the president. We actually elect the president through a system called the Electoral College. So I wanted to take a couple of episodes to explain what the Electoral College is, how it works, and maybe offer some defenses of this system that has categorically been attacked by most people, especially on the left, over the last few years. The Electoral College is a system that seeks to create an executive that is not really for just the majority, not the majority of people, but essentially it creates a rule for the executive over a certain kind of majority. As I explained in an earlier episode, the United States is not a democracy. Democracies elect their leaders based on pure voting. Whoever wins becomes the person who holds that seat. That is not what we are. We are a federal republic with a democratic election system. And part of that federal republic is to have an election system that is popular amongst all of the people, but not all the people directly, rather all the people state by state. And that is what the electoral system is. The Electoral College essentially is a meeting of people, and I think it is important for us to address that. It's not a college in the traditional sense of a college. The Electoral College is like the College of Cardinals. If you're not aware, the College of Cardinals is the group that elects the Pope, and they are the cardinals from all of the dioceses all across the world. When the Pope dies, after a certain set amount of days, they all meet together in Rome, and then they cast votes to decide who will be the new Pope. Similarly, the Electoral College is made up of people from all across the country. Now, they aren't the actual other elected people, but they are representative of all of the seats in the House and the Senate. As you may recall from our legislative episode, there are 435 House seats and 100 Senate seats. Now, the number of electors is actually 538, not 535. Well, that extra 3 comes because 3 electors are from the District of Columbia. Now, generally speaking, those in the District of Columbia have a situation that is very similar to taxation without representation. They do not have representatives in Congress, not voting members anyway. They do not have representation in the Senate, much like the territories of the United States. American Samoa, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, these places, they send representatives to Congress, but they're non-voting members. They're only there to represent the interests of the people in that territory. D.C. is just like this. They don't have voting members. They only send someone to represent them. But in the national election for the president, they are given 3 electors. So the votes for president in the District of Columbia go to choosing those 3 electors. And that wasn't always the case. Obviously, in earlier episodes, we talked about how the District of Columbia wasn't in existence when the United States was founded, but the 23rd Amendment, ratified in 1961, added those 3 electors for the District of Columbia. Now, in order to win the election, a presidential candidate must reach 270 electors, representing half, or one more than half, of the 538 electors that are available. That's why in most of the news coverage, you're going to see the race to 270 and the adding up of state values to try and figure out how 270 can be accomplished. In the next episode, we are going to get into the history of the Electoral College, why it came to be, and address some of the questions that are generally asked about the Electoral College. In fact, there are 3 main criticisms of the Electoral College, and they are usually laid out as thus. First, that it's undemocratic, essentially that it's not a direct vote. So why do we use that system? 2, that it permits the election of a candidate who does not win the most votes. We've actually seen that happen a couple of times only in recent history. 2000 with Bush and 2016 with Hillary Clinton. The Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost in the Electoral College, and in 2000 Bush lost the electoral vote lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. And it's happened 3 other times in history, all of those before 1888. That 1888 election was actually a tie, 269 to 269, which is theoretically possible under the current system. And the third criticism is that the winner-take-all approach cancels the vote of the losing candidates in each state. And we're going to address all 3 of those criticisms while getting into the history of it in the next episode. But in a few weeks, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, the date when the Constitution holds that we must hold our presidential election, we will all go to the polls, or we will have sent in our ballots ahead of time. And although you may be casting a ballot for one presidential candidate or another, the fact is that you are not. You are casting a ballot for an elector for your district and your state to send to the Electoral College. On the first Monday after the second Wednesday of December, those electors will meet at the state capitol of all 50 states across the country, and they will tally their vote and certify their vote to send off to Congress as their decision on this state for the election. Once Congress receives all those certified results from all of the 50 states, they will then certify the results of the entire election, and that will be done on the first week of January after the new Congress, the one that is elected in November and sits for the first time on January 3rd of the new year. They will be sworn in, and one of their first duties is to certify the results of the election from all 50 states. The situation is a joint hearing of Congress, the Senate, and the House, and is presided over by the Vice President as the President of the Senate, and they will certify the results if there is a majority vote. If there is not a majority vote, meaning none of the candidates have hit 270, the House on its own then turns into a presidential election session, and one vote is assigned to each of the 50 state delegates. So that means each state gets one vote, no matter how many representatives actually come from that state. The Senate then goes into their own separate session, and they decide the vice president. But unlike the House, each senator gets one vote. So there will be 50 votes in the House. By state, there will be 100 votes in the Senate by senator. Then the elected president, elected by either the Electoral College, the group of electors that meet in their state capitals, or by the House and the Senate, will be inaugurated on January the 20th of that year. And that is the situation that we are walking into in just a few weeks. But just tomorrow, you'll be able to know a little bit more about the history of the Electoral College and some of its issues. Today, we are going to discuss the history of the Electoral College and some of its main criticisms, and I will try to address those, and we'll see why perhaps the Electoral College is a good thing. As I mentioned in the last episode, the first of the three main criticisms are that the Electoral College is undemocratic. Essentially, that it deprives the one person, one vote ideal that we seek in this country, and it puts the election in the hands of electors rather than the people. Many argue that it represents the founders' fear that a group of people, the vast majority of voters who might decide who the president is best confirmed by maybe some wiser and more affluent people. Therefore, the people could vote, but they're really voting for electors. And those electors, well, they get to decide. And people think that because many states, only since 2000, have actually enacted laws against faithless electors, meaning that until 2000, there was nothing stopping an elector who was sent to the state as part of the Electoral College from voting for the other guy. They got to decide who was the best candidate for president and cast their vote as they deemed appropriate. But this ignores a very important part of our historical discussion, and that is the argument amongst the 13 colonies about big colonies versus small colonies. If you'll remember from our legislative episode, that there was a compromise made amongst those who were founding the country about how the legislative arm of the government would be built. One house is decided proportionately by population, the House of Representatives. One is equal amongst all the states, with each having the same representation. This would allow the smaller states to have just as much of a say as the larger states. And even back when 13 colonies were talking about becoming a country, there was a concern amongst the smaller states that the larger states with bigger populations and more representatives would run ramshot over them. And in fact, this fear went not only to the government, the legislative arm, but the executive. In fact, the smaller states like Rhode Island and Delaware, they proffered that the president should, instead of being elected by the people, be elected by the 13 state legislatures, the way that senators were elected for the beginning of our country's history. There were others who wanted Congress to elect the president, like a parliament and the speaker. That way there would be proportional vote based on the House and an equal vote based in the Senate, and between the two, they would be able to come to a decision that represented most of the country. Representatives from large states, like Madison from Virginia, obviously preferred a direct vote because there was more people in Virginia, and they thought that they could help direct the future of the country if the states with more population were also choosing the president. And what happened was a compromise, much like most of our founding fathers' decisions about the government. Because you see, the Electoral College is a direct vote, meaning one person, one vote, on a state-by-state basis. Instead of looking at, for the presidential election, how did they do nationally, you have to win states. And each state is given a value based on its population size. But no one state can control the election. And because it's essentially a direct vote on a state-by-state basis, it's no more undemocratic than the House or the Senate. And I will get to in the next episode why that is such an important concept. The idea that it's a state-by-state direct election. The second criticism that comes from the Electoral College is that it permits the election of a candidate who does not win the most votes. And obviously, in the last few years, that has been the major complaint. Essentially, it takes away majority rule. As I said in the last episode, election of a president who wins the Electoral College but not the popular vote has happened exactly 5 times, 3 times in 1888 and before, and then twice in 2000 and 2016. But something that these critics don't remember is that there have been times when the president who was elected did not win a majority of votes. It's very easy for us to think in a two-party system where the Democrats and the Republicans are typically in power that, well, whoever the Democratic or the Republican candidate was, won 50%. But on several occasions, in 1912, when Roosevelt and Debs ran as third-party candidates, 1968, when Wallace ran as one, in 1992, in 1996, when Ross Perot and then later his party ran as third-party candidates, and Nader in 2000. And of course, there was that concern in 2016 with the Green Party and the Libertarian Party both running candidates. But in all of those occasions, 18 of them, in fact, a president was elected without having a majority of the vote. Some infamous names on that list: Lincoln, Wilson, Truman, Kennedy, and Clinton. Now, while these presidents won the vote, meaning they were the plurality winner, they won the most electoral votes, and that made them the electoral winner. But in every case, they did not hit 50%. So in those elections, there was no majority vote holder. There was just the plurality winner, meaning the one who got the most votes of all the candidates. And if we're looking at the issue of majority, the idea of a national electoral college creates a national majority, meaning that it's more likely that the elected candidate represents the will of all 50 states rather than just a few states. Now, we do like in the modern times to break down this argument into certain counties and certain states, and oftentimes it does come down to the elections in those counties and those states, but that's only because the entrenchment of the two parties in every other state. The reality is that in every single election, every single state can help that candidate get to 270, and whether or not they're entrenched, the boots on the ground effort by the volunteers and workers in the campaign can make a real difference. The third criticism of the Electoral College is that the winner-takes-all approach, meaning that no matter how a vote breaks down in a state, the winner of that state gets the majority or all of the electors from that state, cancels the vote of the losing candidates in each state, meaning if you lose a state by one vote, then none of those votes count. Only the winning votes that add to the electors are the ones that are counted. But it's important to remember that if we were to have a direct vote, that the people voted for directly for president, that essentially all of the people who voted for the losing candidates would have their votes canceled out in the same way. Now, again, in 5 elections where the popular vote wasn't aligned with the Electoral College, this could possibly be an argument. But generally speaking, the times when the popular vote did not align with the electoral vote, those differences in popular vote can be tied to certain strongholds for one party or the other, and generally those strongholds are large urban areas. In the next episode, we are going to talk about why it is very important that we don't allow the Electoral College to go away, and why that focus on the urban areas may be a bad thing, and how the Electoral College protects us from it. In the last episode, we addressed some of the criticisms of the Electoral College, and I want to take the time in this episode to outline what the impact of getting rid of the Electoral College may be and why it is so important. And we'll go through kind of a checklist, but there will be some meandering, so please forgive me. We'll try to keep things as orderly as possible during this episode, but a lot of these issues are interrelated with each other. The first and probably most important reason for the Electoral College, or the impact of having it taken away, is that the president would no longer be elected by the collective will of all 50 states. Small states like Rhode Island and Delaware and Hawaii and Alaska, states where there may be physical land small but also population small, obviously Alaska is a very large state by land, they would just be ignored during elections because it would not be worth traveling there for the number of voters that you would reach there. More importantly, nationwide, even if a candidate was to visit a state, they would stick only to the urban areas. They'd no longer seek to win the entire state. They would just basically go to the largest population centers and focus on them. And that would essentially alienate millions of people in small towns, rural states, counties all over the country, like Iowa and Wyoming, and once again, Alaska. And I think there's a really telling fact that can kind of show this. I currently live in LA County, the city of Los Angeles, which is part of LA County, and the state of California. And of course, California is a large state. It's one of the largest states, and it has a very high population. It has several large cities that all have a large population. But I want to focus on LA County specifically because, in fact, more people live in LA County than live in the following states: Wyoming, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Maryland, Missouri, Tennessee, Indiana, Arizona, Massachusetts, Washington, Virginia, New Jersey, and North Carolina. And not only LA County, but Cook County, which is this county where Chicago is located, also has that many people in it. And the city of New York has similarly more people. For instance, Suffolk County has more people than Wyoming, West Virginia, and Nebraska combined. And Queens County has more people than Wyoming and New Mexico combined. And the entire New York metropolitan area has as many people as Los Angeles County. Essentially what you're looking at is 3 counties, or essentially 3 cities, that have 40 million people in them and who have larger populations than 13 other states. So if we add up the 13 times 3, that's 39. That means 3 cities have the population or the voting power of 39 states. Essentially, a presidential candidate would only have to win Cook County, LA County, and New York City, all of the counties of the New York metropolitan area, and you would win the election. And that's, of course, forgetting about the Bay Area. The county of where San Francisco is located has a county population that's the size of Wyoming and West Virginia and Nebraska. In fact, there are 4 counties in the Bay Area that have that same size population. So you see that in the urban areas, that's where the voters are. They're clustered. And without an electoral college to say, hey, presidential candidates, you're going to have to go to Michigan, Ohio, Iowa, New Hampshire, Delaware, they probably would never go there. More importantly, if you have to win in only the cities, you start focusing on just urban issues. And you kind of go away from national problems, national solutions, and look more at state solutions, and especially city solutions. And that would undermine the stability of the 2-party system that we have in the United States. Essentially, this would create a splintered set of regional and issue-oriented parties that could spring up, and they would actually impact not only local elections, but the national presidential election as well. If you, as the mayor of Los Angeles, can sway the same number of voters as 13 states, you come into the election already with a hand up. And that would essentially move the country from a binary party system all through a 3rd party, a 4th party, a 5th party, to an insanely high multi-level party system where governing coalitions are required, meaning every state kind of sends a different leftist or rightist party into Washington, and they have to form a working coalition there in order to get anything done. These can be very fragile, they can be ineffective, and those governments can be very short-lived. There are many European countries that show this to be true. Greece, Italy, France, these countries have all had a history of difficulties having a functioning legislative branch when it is splintered into so many multi-parties. And of course, with all of those parties come presidential candidates. And essentially, they wouldn't even have to win. If you're the mayor of LA, you have a hand up in an election nationally just by being able to sway the 10 million people in LA County. But you could also be a spoiler and just deny another candidate, someone who did well, 50% of the vote. Now, in an election where we're going to direct voting, we can't depend on a plurality. We need a majority. So that would start a runoff process. Now we run one election, the top 2 contenders then do a runoff, and that person who wins now has to be the winner. And even less people are able to actually take part in the process. Less people feel like they're heard. And more importantly, the presidential candidates don't need to compromise. They can be whatever they want and whoever they want, and they know that if they win enough votes, that they will be elected president and they haven't had to compromise whatever they thought in the process. And not to get too far into politics, but for instance, Kamala Harris, the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket, is very much against fracking. However, the presidential candidate, Joe Biden, is for fracking, in so much as he won't regulate the industry. And he recognizes that to win votes in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Oklahoma, he needs to be okay with fracking. Now, there is a compromise he is making there. I want to win certain states. I'm going to compromise about this issue because it's important to people in those states. He has been the entire election compromising that issue. Kamala, when she went from being a contender for the presidency to a vice presidential candidate on the ticket, changed her position and began to support no regulation for fracking. These kind of compromises will not occur in a system where it's direct election. Both of those candidates, Kamala Harris from California, Joe Biden from Delaware, would just be candidates straight through to November, and we'd have to wait and see who got the most of the two votes. More importantly, if there is a candidate who can get one, either left, right, liberal, or conservative voters behind them, they can essentially use the fraction on the other side in order to sneak in that 50% plus one and take the election. Essentially, what I'm describing is no longer a union. It's not the United States anymore. In fact, some of those states who would feel like they'd never seen a presidential candidate or they hadn't in a long time and their issues were being ignored and in exchange for the issues of urban populations, which they don't have in their rural areas, may just decide they don't want to be part of that union anymore. The founders were always worried that it was tenuous bringing together these states that were so different, and that problem has not changed. Already once in our history, some of the states decided to go their own way, and it took a war with 800,000 dead in order to bring them back together. And the Electoral College is an every 4-year process that assures that we don't walk down that path again, at least not when it comes to electing our leader. The Electoral College is a unique, yes, but very simple, Republican electoral mechanism. It creates a presidential majority, meaning you win 50% of the votes that are available, engenders national presidential campaigns, and looks for popularity for candidates that can be popular nationwide. And it keeps the federalist system robust. So I have a question for those people who would look to abolish the Electoral College. What do you replace it with? Given the facts that I've put forward, would you replace it with a direct one person, one vote for the presidency? Would you risk what there is to risk in that situation? In many ways, our electoral system and our government itself is like a watch. There are a lot of small pieces that are all working in union to make the thing continue ticking. If you take out any of those pieces, it may stop working altogether. So if we're going to replace the Electoral College with something else, we have to make sure that it's not going to fall apart in our own hands. I have a question for you. What do you call today? For 3 out of 4 of you, you don't have a name for today. Maybe October 30th or the day before Halloween. But for 1/4 of you, you do have a special name just for today. If you're from northern New Jersey or New York State, you might call today Goosey Night. If you're from the Great Lakes region, it might be Devil's Night. If you're from upstate New York, New England, or even down into Kentucky, Ohio, or the lower Great Lakes region, you might call it Cabbage Night. And for some of you along the Canadian border on both sides, you might call it Matt Night. But if you're from New Orleans or most of New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, like where I'm from, basically the mid-Atlantic area, then you're going to call today Mischief Night. As a kid who grew up in Maryland, I probably celebrated Mischief Night more than any other holiday, including Halloween, because I grew up in a very conservative Christian family, so for much of my childhood, I didn't celebrate Halloween at all. But when I became a teenager and I was in control of my own schedule and where I went, well, I took advantage of Mischief Night, up to and including some harmless pranks that may or may not have also been including hanging a dummy in a tree that we would drop on unsuspecting kids the next night and take their candy. But Mischief Night goes back a long way, and it's not just an American holiday. It actually goes back all the way to 1790. At least that's what the first mention of it, when a headmaster at a school in the United Kingdom mentioned Mischief Night as something that boys should get into and do get into. He was talking about Mischief Night as it was associated with May Day, meaning the day before May Day was a day when children would go and get into mischief and play pranks and basically just be out in the street. But of course, May Day was a celebration of the harvest or the start of spring. And once children moved from the rural areas into the city, May Day had much less significance to them. And in fact, that night of mischief was moved from the springtime to the fall, just before Halloween first, and then more on coinciding with Guy Fawkes Day on November 5th. Now, we're going to do a special episode about Guy Fawkes Day, so we'll talk more about it when we get there, but let's focus on its location right before Halloween, where it stopped when it came to America. If you're unfamiliar with Mischief Night, it generally requires going around and toilet papering houses, egging houses or cars, lighting something on fire and ringing a doorbell and running away. Sometimes you can write messages on windows in soap, powder bomb someone's car or yard, fork a yard, which is where you stick a bunch of forks in the yard, prongs down, just as a random display. Of course, the ever popular fireworks, and a, more seasonal tradition of busting up pumpkins and jack-o'-lanterns that have been left on people's stoops. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries, when it first started in the UK, the pranks were similar, maybe less focused on individual people. Children, meaning really teenagers, would go around switching road signs, making the arrow point the wrong direction, or taking signs from in front of stores. And of course, there were troughs places for horses to water. They would turn those over, but just general harmless pranks. When exactly it jumped the Atlantic is a little unclear, but it was first mentioned in the 30s and 40s during that war period as something that would occur. Teenagers would go around and create mischief on the night before Halloween. It's likely that this was forged because around that same time, Halloween was being forced into the role of a family-friendly holiday. The focus had gone away from witchcraft and all of the dark arts and more about children going trick-or-treating. And with that focus on children and trick-or-treating, all of the mischief went to the night before. But we, of course, put our own American spin on it. Rather than doing more harmless pranks, we would do things like breaking windows, starting fires, and, something that's still popular, Ding Dong Ditch. After World War II ended, Mischief Night continued, being more of a nuisance than anything else, but as the 20th century progressed, it actually became more and more dangerous. In fact, by 1984, Detroit started calling Mischief Night Devil's Night, and that was because over 1,000 fires were set that year in the city of Detroit on that one night. By 1986, the city had actually put a curfew in place for anyone under the age of 18 on that night, and they changed the name from Devil's Night to Angel's Night because some 40,000 angels went and walked the streets to try and keep kids from getting into trouble. After this low in the mid-'80s, things seemed to calm down, going back towards probably the role that it took in the 30s and 40s. Sure, there is a Mischief Night. As a kid growing up in the 90s, I can tell you I did some pretty wild things. Egging houses, check. Toilet papering houses, check. Powder bombing houses, check. And individuals, all three, yeah. Hanging a dummy in a tree to scare kids the next night, did that. But we never went as far as setting fires or breaking windows or doing anything too crazy. And my understanding is that's basically where things are today. For those of you who don't know Mischief Night and haven't had any experience, you may have actually experienced through pop culture. For a lot of us, the 1994 movie The Crow would have been the first time we experienced Mischief Night. It's actually on Mischief Night in Detroit, or Devil's Night, that the main character and his girlfriend are murdered on some crime spree of people in the city. And there have actually been several movies called Mischief Night, where either the mischief got out of hand, or it was a, boys will be boys kind of story about kids acting out on that night. And if you're a fan of Orange is the New Black, they actually did a Mischief Night episode as well, where around the Halloween holiday, there were pranks being pulled on people during the episode. So if you live in the Northeast, Mischief Night is likely to come to your neighborhood tonight. Now, it may have a little kibosh put on it by the COVID-19 virus, but I'm guessing that all these kids with all these pent-up emotions and anger and maybe just energy are likely to come out and hit the streets in force. So you may want to keep an eye on your front lawn on this year's Mischief Night. We'll be back tomorrow, and we're going to talk about the history and all of the trivia about Halloween. So today we're going to talk about what is frankly the fascinating history of Halloween and how it came to be the favorite American holiday for a lot of people, including me. Now, you're probably familiar with all of the, modern symbols of Halloween, where the jack-o'-lantern and bats and witches and black cats and all of those things, and bobbing for apples, horror films, playing pranks, haunted attractions. But where do all of those things come from? Well, the fact is, over 3,000 years, almost all of those traditions can be traced to one place or another. The actual roots of Halloween come from a pagan Celtic celebration of Samhain. Samhain was essentially their New Year's Eve. The New Year began on November 1st, so October 31st was New Year's Eve, and it was a new year heading into the coldest and darkest months of the year. The Celts lived about 2,000 years BCE, which would be nearly 4,000 years ago. Between then and 1,000 years BCE, or about 3,000 years ago, and they lived in the areas of northern France, the United Kingdom, and Ireland. So they would celebrate their New Year's by creating a huge bonfire, and then they would go in their homes and quash their hearths so there would be no fire, and then they would go light this big bonfire and make sacrifices to their gods. Now, they did this because they believed that the boundary line between the world of the living and the world of the dead was especially thin on Samhain, and that ghosts may come back. So, in order to have protection, they would make sacrifices to their gods. They would also wear costumes that were usually made of the skins of, or to look like, the skins of animals with their heads as well. This was to hide their identity from those ghosts that may be wandering the earth looking for revenge, and also as a way of celebrating the sacrifices that were being made to the gods. One other interesting thing is that the Celts and the Druids, who were there around the same time, believed that this ultra-thin border between the world of the living and the dead made predicting the future extra specially possible on this day, and they actually had several celebrations trying to divinate what was going to happen in the next year and the years to come. When the time for Samhain was over, they would relight the fires inside their own homes and their kitchens with fire from that sacred bonfire, and they believed that this would help protect their homes for the long winter and the year to come. By the year 50 CE, the Roman Empire had conquered most of the lands where the Celts and the Druids had called home before. And the Romans wanted to try and bring the Celts and the Druids into their own culture. So to do this, they looked to meld those local pagan beliefs with the beliefs of the Romans themselves. And the Romans actually created such a big empire by doing this, wherever they went. So they did this by combining the pagan holiday of Samhain with two Roman holidays. The first was the holiday of Feralia. Feralia was a celebration of the dead where you honored members of your family and members of your community who had passed that year and in the years before. Another was a celebration for the Roman goddess Pomona. Pomona is the goddess of fruit and trees, and she is symbolized in an apple. And it is likely that our modern tradition of bobbing for apples actually comes from this combination of Samhain and the celebration of Pomona when the Romans tried to integrate the Celts into their empire. By 609 CE, Rome was still kind of in existence. It was nearing the end / it was over, depending on what part of the world you were in. And Pope Boniface IV dedicated the Parthenon in Rome, which was, a temple to the Roman gods, to all of the Christian martyrs who had ever died. And this was, of course, because now Christianity was the official religion of Rome. He actually created a feast in the early part of the year celebrating the springtime, the rebirth, and it was also a celebration of all the Christian martyrs. Pope Gregory III later moved this day from the springtime around May the 15th, 13th to the 15th, to November 1st. And he actually included in it not just Christian martyrs, but all the saints. And he called this holiday All Saints' Day. Now remember that at this time, Christianity through the Roman Empire had spread to almost all the lands of Rome. So the Celtic lands, where Samhain had transferred into celebrations of Feralia and Pomona, was now being transferred into All Saints' Day. And around the year 1000, the additional holiday on November 2nd was added of All Souls' Day, where you celebrated all of those who had passed, whether they were in your family or in the community. So from November the 1st through November the 2nd, you celebrated all of the saints and then all of the other members of your community who passed. So it was a celebration of the dead. And ironically, All Souls' Day had a similar celebration to the original celebration of Samhain, and that is that they lit big bonfires, people dressed up in costumes as saints and angels or devils, and a feast was held that generally lasted from the night before All Saints' Day through the evening of All Souls' Day. This multi-day period started to be called All Hallows Mass, like Christmas, but for the hallowed people in Christendom. Or for those who separated it out, they started to celebrate All Hallows Eve. And this is where Halloween really came into the parlance. Once All Hallows Eve became an official celebration the night before All Saints' Day, it also began to spread throughout the former Roman Empire. And our word of Halloween comes from an iteration of the word from the United Kingdom. In Scotland and Ireland, they began to celebrate All Hallows Eve. But in those languages, the word Eve is actually even or een, and it's actually contracted E''en. Thus, All Hallows Eve became All Halloween or Halloween. And this transition officially happened somewhere in the 1550s. Something that also happened around this time was the tradition of soul cakes. Now, these were cakes that would be baked by maybe more well-off members of the community, and those who were not so well-off would go around the community on Halloween and on All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, and they would go door to door offering to pray for your family members who may or may not be in purgatory in exchange for a soul cake. And this idea of goodwill in exchange for food or ale actually was the start of the trick-or-treating tradition. During this march around the neighborhood, the community, they would often dress up as saints or angels, devils, and a variety of garb because they couldn't afford to buy a brand new outfit that many people, like parishioners of the church, might have worn at the time. In certain areas, there was also a tradition of mumming, which was to wrap yourself up in disguise, either similar to a mummy or dressed as an angel or a saint, and go singing alms around the neighborhood, kind of similar to Christmas caroling, only for All Hallows Eve. Also, there were parts of the world where they would celebrate, this is generally in Ireland and Scotland as well, they would celebrate by cutting a turnip and hollowing it out and putting a candle inside, and generally putting a face on the turnip itself that would be lit up by the candle. Now, this was a particular callback, if you will, to a pagan tradition where on that night, when the boundary between the living world and the dead world was especially thin, ghosts would, of course, come walking up to your door. Well, the soul cakes were a Christian take on a more pagan tradition of putting out a plate of food or a snack so that any spirits who came to your door would be satiated by the food there and not come inside. And if they weren't satiated by the food, well, maybe they would be scared away by the jack-o'-lantern, or the lantern at that time that would be cut from a turnip. And of course, if you were to go anywhere on that day, mumming or not, you would want to wear a mask. And that way, any souls who were around who might be looking for revenge wouldn't be able to recognize you. In the 16 and 1700s, we really focused more on the mysticism, the witchcraft of Halloween. In fact, many people believed, again, with that boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead being especially thin, it was a good time to try and divinate what might happen in the future. It is so strange how we always return to those same themes. And there were different rituals, generally carried out by women, to try and divinate what their mate or their love life might be like for the future. They would do things like throwing apple peels over their shoulders to hopefully hope that the peels would spell out the initials of their husband. They would try to ghost write, which is sitting down with a pen and just allowing your hand to move, and the ghost would come in and move the hand for you and divinate something. And possibly the most strange, something similar to what kids actually do today. They would go into a dark room with a candle, and they would sit in front of the candle and basically call to the spirits to show them who they would marry, and then light the candle, and theoretically, they would see the face or the reflection of their future mate in the mirror. This is very similar to the Bloody Mary thing that kids do today, where they go in a dark bathroom, say Bloody Mary 3 times, and then she's supposed to appear. This brings us up to Halloween impacting the American continent. Well, Halloween didn't really catch on in America for the most part. The puritanical beliefs of those in the New England and the Mid-Atlantic states basically meant that they didn't celebrate holidays like All Hallows Eve. They were Protestants, not Anglicans, not Catholics, so those saints' days weren't celebrated. But in Maryland, which was a Catholic colony, and in some of the colonies to the south, which were more business-related and had less to do about religion, and therefore you were allowed to practice your religion more freely, the celebrations of Halloween did make the jump over the Atlantic to the Americas. But there, instead of focusing on the individual, they were usually community celebrations where the community would come together in sort of a harvest celebration. Again, more reminiscent of Samhain, where we all began with this. But in the mid-1800s, when immigration to America really ramped up, especially from places like Ireland and Southern Europe, that caused an influx of a lot of Catholics, those who might celebrate All Saints' Day or All Souls' Day, and they brought their celebrations with them. This is when the idea of jack-o'-lanterns came to America and started being celebrated. But again, at the close of the 1800s, the idea was more about the witchcraft and the mysticism of Halloween and less about how we think about it today. So there was a slow transition during this period and into the early 1900s where communities wanted to get away from that darkness, especially Christian-led communities, wanted to get away from the darkness and the devil worship of witchcraft and mysticism and start making the holiday something else. And that is when we embrace the traditions that had first happened in the South in America of community parties and coming together like a harvest festival. And we tried to kind of meld those together with some of the Halloween traditions we already used. And by the 1920s and 30s, communities came together for parties that were essentially harvest parties with costumes, but the costumes weren't for adults, they were for the kids. And through the interwar period, World War II, and then after World War II, the holiday really became what we know it as today. The idea of trick-or-treating, well, when people went to the suburbs and families were in separate houses instead of separate apartments, the idea of trick-or-treating really took off, where we're going to have a candy at our house and all the kids in the neighborhood will go around collecting it, again, taking that ancient tradition and making it something more modern. They also kept up the community parties, but again, the focus was on families and children and away from the darkness that had kind of interspersed itself with Halloween. And the baby boomers of the World War II period gave birth to a generation. They then gave birth to essentially my generation, and as a kid born in the 80s, raised in the 90s, this is basically how I lived. I lived a carbon copy of the life that my parents lived, only questionably better, maybe more modern. But what we've seen in the next generation is that as people put off having a family, they have started reliving those memories of their childhood into adulthood. And thus, the return of the adult Halloween party, of adult costuming, has started. And now even our pets are getting in on the action. Instead of putting costumes on kids, since we don't have kids, we put costumes on pets. So where we started way back 3,000 years ago with putting on animal skins as costumes to protect us in our sacrifices to the gods, now we put costumes on our animals so that we can go out and have a good time. Well, I did promise you a few connections to your favorite Halloween things and where they come from. So let's go through a list of those things now, shall we? First up, bats. Bats are probably the most well-known association with Halloween. Now, you might think that that association comes from vampires, which are associated with Halloween, but in fact, that may be reversed. all the way back when Samhain was being celebrated by the pagans. Remember, they were lighting a huge bonfire. Well, that bonfire was likely to attract insects, and insects would have attracted bats. And so during these celebrations in the October, November area, there would have been swarms of bats circling over this celebration. And this actually started a root of some mythology around bats. Like, if a bat roosts in your home, a man may die in the home. And if it circles the roof, that may mean a woman is going to die in your home. Well, what about black cats? Again, this may actually be more of the dog wagging the tail rather than the tail wagging the dog. Because it was believed, again, when the boundary between the world of the living and the dead was at its thinnest, that witches' power was at their most fierce, and they would be their most bold, going out and casting spells all over the countryside. But it was also believed that if a witch was caught in the midst of a spell, she could transform herself, especially on Halloween night, into a cat, naturally, a black cat. So it was thought that black cats seen around this time might be witches in disguise. As I said, the tradition of apple bobbing probably goes back to the celebration of Pomona, all the way back when the Romans were trying to bring the Celts into the fold. Trick-or-treating is likely, the soul cakes combined with trying to make it a focus on children rather than adults. But those soul cakes were said to be sweet, so candy is just a different form of sweets. And by making them individually wrapped, it's there for a modern society. How about skulls and bones? Well, Christians believe that the skulls and bones of the dead hold a special power, especially on the day that the boundary between the world of the living and the dead was thinnest. And obviously, wanting to focus on Christians and saints, they put a prize on finding Christian or saint bones. And so the focus of the skull and the skeletons was actually likely a Christian tradition, which is still held up today, that on holy days, that if churches had a set of bones from a saint or a martyr, they would bring out those bones and use them in a parade, a holy parade. So the association between Halloween and skeletons likely started there. And when it comes to the haunted attractions, a haunted house, well, this has actually grown out of, again, moving away from the mysticism and dark magic and into family fun. There was actually still traditions in many places of having bonfires on the night of Halloween, and that was how the community would come together. But it was found out that a lot of people were using these fires for sorts of divination, which was not what most people wanted. So instead of holding a bonfire, they would hold another similar event. And oftentimes this would be in the form of a haunted house. It was one place that everyone could go. They could have their harvest celebration outside with some scares, which seemed kind of dark, but not too scary for kids. And it was a nice melding of all of those traditions. And after all this discussion, you probably think of Halloween as a very secular holiday, although it has roots in paganism and different paganism and Christianity, Catholicism, and then Protestantism. It actually seems to be a very secular holiday. However, there are many religions that don't allow the celebration of Halloween because of its source in All Hallows Eve. Hindus are not allowed to celebrate Halloween. They have their own day, essentially their Day of the Dead, that they celebrate. The same can be said for Muslims, who have their own day and they must keep separate from traditions. And very Orthodox Jews also do not celebrate Halloween because it is a secular religion. Because even as a secular day of celebration, it is a Gentile custom. And Jews have their own day where they celebrate by dressing up in costume and going door to door in Purim. Still, even with those limitations, Halloween is possibly one of the most non-religious, secular-focused holidays that is celebrated nearly all around the world. But here in the United States, it still remains a central faction, a central function of growing up in America. Now, if you grew up a little further south, you may have celebrated Dia de los Muertos. And tomorrow we are going to talk about Dia de los Muertos and how it differs from the celebration of Halloween. I cannot wait to speak to you then.